Grace Patricia Kelly wasn't just another pretty face in 1950s Hollywood. She was the embodiment of everything America wanted to be. Born into Philadelphia high society in 1929, Grace carried herself with an elegance that seemed almost otherworldly, as if she had been carved from marble by the gods themselves. Little did the world know that beneath her porcelain exterior lay a woman of fierce determination and carefully guarded secrets. Her ascent to stardom was meteoric. After studying at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, Grace's breakthrough came with High Noon in 1952, where she played opposite Gary Cooper. But it was Alfred Hitchcock who truly understood her magnetic presence, casting her in 3 consecutive films that would define her legacy: Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, and To Catch a Thief. Hitchcock once said, Grace had sexual elegance, a quality so rare that it couldn't be manufactured or taught. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to convey vulnerability and strength simultaneously, making audiences fall in love with her while never fully revealing her true self. This enigmatic quality would follow her throughout her life, creating layers of mystery that even those closest to her struggled to penetrate. By 1955, at just 26 years old, Grace had conquered Hollywood. Her Oscar win for The Country Girl solidified her status as one of cinema's greatest talents. But fame came with a price that few understood. Behind the glamorous facade, Grace was already growing weary of the Hollywood machine, yearning for something deeper, something more meaningful than the superficial world of movie sets and red carpets. The truth, no one dared to speak, was that Grace Kelly was trapped in a golden cage of her own making, beloved by millions but truly known by very few. In May 1955, Grace Kelly's life took a turn that seemed ripped from one of her own movies. During the Cannes Film Festival, she was invited to Monaco for what was supposed to be a simple photo shoot at the palace. Prince Rainier III, the handsome bachelor ruler of the tiny principality, was immediately smitten. What began as a carefully orchestrated publicity event would soon become the love story the world desperately wanted to believe, but finally revealed documents and insider accounts paint a different picture of their whirlwind romance. The marriage negotiations read more like a business merger than a fairy tale courtship. Grace's father, John Kelly Sr., reportedly had to provide a dowry of $2 million, a staggering sum that would be equivalent to nearly $20 million today. The prince needed an heir and financial stability for his struggling nation. Grace needed an escape from the suffocating world of Hollywood. Their courtship was conducted largely through letters and carefully chaperoned meetings. When Grace announced her engagement after knowing Rainier for less than a year, even her closest friends were stunned. Cary Grant, her co-star and rumored lover, reportedly begged her to reconsider, warning her that she was trading her artistic soul for a crown that might prove to be made of fool's gold. The wedding of the century took place on April 19, 1956, broadcast to an estimated 30 million viewers worldwide. Grace looked radiant in her Helen Rose gown. But those who knew her best noticed something in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even regret. As she walked down the aisle of St. Nicholas Cathedral, she was walking away from not just Hollywood, but from the woman she had fought so hard to become. The fairy tale had begun. But little did the world know that every fairy tale comes with a price that must eventually be paid. The transformation from Grace Kelly to Princess Grace was more dramatic than any role she had ever played. Monaco in the 1950s was a gambling haven desperate for respectability, and Grace became its most valuable asset. She threw herself into royal duties with the same dedication she had brought to her craft. But those closest to her began to notice subtle changes that hinted at deeper struggles. Former palace staff, speaking decades later under condition of anonymity, revealed that Grace often spent hours alone in her private quarters, sometimes crying inconsolably. The woman who had commanded millions of dollars per film was now required to ask permission for the most basic decisions. Her mail was monitored, her movements carefully orchestrated, and her every public appearance scripted down to the smallest detail. The birth of her children, Carolyn in 1957, Albert in 1958, and Stephanie in 1965, provided Grace with purpose, but also created new sources of tension. Rainier, raised in the rigid traditions of European monarchy, believed in strict discipline and formal education. Grace, with her American sensibilities, wanted her children to experience some semblance of normal childhood. These philosophical differences created fractures in their marriage that would only deepen with time. Hollywood, friends who visited the palace were shocked by what they found. The vivacious, quick-witted woman they had known seemed subdued, almost ghost-like at times. Director George Stevens, who had worked with Grace on Giant, later confided to friends that during a 1960s visit, Grace had pulled him aside and asked, with tears in her eyes, "Do you think I made a mistake, George?" The truth, no one dared to say, was that the princess was slowly losing herself behind the golden bars of her fairy tale life. By the 1970s, cracks in the fairy tale marriage had become impossible to hide from those within Monaco's inner circle. Grace, now in her 40s and struggling with the weight of royal expectations, began seeking solace in relationships that would scandalize the principality if they ever became public knowledge. The first whispers centered around Robert Dornhelm, a young Austrian filmmaker who had been hired to direct a poetry reading featuring Grace. Their collaboration quickly evolved into something far more intimate. Palace insiders reported seeing them in deep, private conversations that lasted for hours, their body language suggesting a connection that went far beyond professional courtesy. When the project concluded, Dornhelm remained in Monaco for several additional months officially as a cultural consultant, but privately as Grace's confidant and many believed, her lover. Even more explosive were the rumors surrounding Dr. Francis Gray, an American physician who had become the royal family's trusted medical advisor. Gray was married with children, but his relationship with Grace transcended typical doctor-patient boundaries. They were frequently seen together at cultural events, and Grace reportedly funded several of his medical research projects. When Gray's wife confronted Grace directly about their relationship during a palace reception in 1978, witnesses described an awkward silence that seemed to confirm everyone's suspicions. Perhaps most damaging to Grace's carefully constructed image was her alleged affair with a prominent Monaco businessman whose identity was so carefully guarded that even palace staff referred to him only as the gentleman. This relationship reportedly lasted for nearly 3 years and included romantic getaways disguised as charitable missions throughout Europe. Little did the world know that Princess Grace's search for authentic connection was driving her toward choices that would ultimately contribute to the tragic events of September 1982. Grace Kelly's greatest joy and deepest sorrow came in the form of her 3 children, each of whom would challenge her in ways that Hollywood had never prepared her for. By the late 1970s, the fairy tale family portrait was cracking under the weight of teenage rebellion, royal expectations, and a mother's desperate attempts to protect her children from the same gilded prison that had trapped her. Carolyn, the eldest, was perhaps the most like her mother, beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely independent. But where Grace had channeled her rebellion into art, Carolyn chose a more destructive path. Her wild parties in Paris, her relationships with older men, and her eventual marriage to Philippe Junot against her parents' wishes created a scandal that rocked the principality. Grace reportedly spent sleepless nights pacing her private chambers, torn between her maternal instincts and her royal obligations. Albert, the heir to the throne, presented different challenges. Quiet and introspective, he struggled under the enormous pressure of his future responsibilities. Grace worried constantly about his apparent reluctance to embrace royal life, seeing in him the same trapped expression she often caught in her own mirror. Their relationship was complicated by Rainier's insistence that Albert be raised according to rigid royal protocols, while Grace desperately wanted to give him the freedom she had never known. But it was Stephanie, the youngest, who would ultimately break Grace's heart most completely. By 1982, 17-year-old Stephanie was already showing signs of the rebellious spirit that would later make her one of Europe's most controversial royal figures. Her relationship with her mother had become increasingly strained, with explosive arguments that palace staff described as heartbreaking to witness. The truth finally revealed is that Grace's relationship with her children had become one of her greatest sources of pain, contributing to the emotional turmoil that would cloud her judgment on that fatal September day. As Grace Kelly entered her 50s, those closest to her began noticing alarming changes in both her physical appearance and mental state. The woman who had once moved through life with balletic grace now seemed to carry an invisible weight that was slowly crushing her spirit. Palace physicians, bound by royal confidentiality, would never publicly discuss their observations. But leaked medical records years later would reveal the shocking truth about Grace's deteriorating condition. Chronic headaches plagued her daily life, often leaving her bedridden for hours at a time. What the public was told were royal migraines were actually symptoms of something far more serious. Grace had begun experiencing what medical experts now recognize as transient ischemic attacks, mini-strokes that affected her coordination, vision, and judgment. The royal family's insistence on maintaining the fairy tale image meant that Grace received inadequate medical attention for these warning signs. Her emotional state was equally fragile. Former lady-in-waiting Madge Tivy-Falcon, who served Grace for over a decade, later revealed in private interviews that the princess had become increasingly withdrawn and melancholy. She would sit by her bedroom window for hours, staring out at the Mediterranean, and I could see tears streaming down her face, Tivy-Falcon recalled. When I asked if she needed anything, she would just shake her head and whisper, "I need to go home, but I don't know where that is anymore." The princess had also begun experiencing what psychologists would now identify as panic attacks. During public appearances, Grace would sometimes grip the arm of whoever stood beside her with such force that it left bruises. Her breathing would become shallow and rapid, and she would excuse herself from events with increasing frequency, Claiming sudden illness, little did the world know that the serene princess they admired was silently fighting a battle against her own mind and body, a battle that would ultimately contribute to the tragedy that awaited her. In the months leading up to September 1982, Grace Kelly's medical team made a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. Struggling to manage her increasing episodes of what they believed were severe migraines and anxiety attacks, Dr. Jean Duplay, the royal family's personal physician, prescribed a cocktail of medications that would prove to be a deadly combination. Prescriptions included spironolactone, a powerful anti-vertigo medication that was known to cause drowsiness and coordination problems. To this was added avamine, an antihistamine used to treat motion sickness, and, most dangerously, a daily dose of Inderal, a beta blocker that could cause sudden drops in blood pressure and episodes of confusion. Medical experts reviewing Grace's case decades later would be horrified by the combination and dosages prescribed. But the truth that would remain hidden for years was even more disturbing. Grace had begun supplementing her prescribed medications with over-the-counter pain relievers and sleeping aids, creating a pharmaceutical cocktail that would have challenged even a much younger person's system. Palace staff later reported finding empty pill bottles hidden throughout Grace's private quarters, suggesting that she was taking far more medication than anyone realized. The princess's personal maid, who remained anonymous until her deathbed confession in 2003, revealed that Grace had become increasingly dependent on these medications to function. She couldn't get through a public appearance without taking pills, the maid disclosed. Sometimes she would take them right before getting in the car, saying they helped her feel calm. I was worried, but she was the princess. Who was I to question her? What makes this revelation even more tragic is that Grace's symptoms, the headaches, the coordination problems, the episodes of confusion were likely being caused or worsened by the very medications prescribed to treat them. She was trapped in a pharmaceutical nightmare that was slowly destroying her ability to function normally. Finally revealed medical records show that in the week before her fatal accident, Grace had increased her medication intake significantly, preparing for what she knew would be a stressful drive with her temperamental teenage daughter. September 13, 1982, began like many other days in the Kelly Grimaldi household with tension thick enough to cut with a knife. 17-year-old Princess Stephanie had been engaged in an ongoing battle with her parents over her future, and Grace found herself caught in the middle of a generational conflict that seemed impossible to resolve. Stephanie wanted to pursue a career in fashion design and had been accepted to study in Paris, but Prince Rainier, with his traditional views on royal responsibility, insisted that she remain in Monaco and prepare for her duties as a working royal. The arguments had been escalating for weeks, with Stephanie threatening to renounce her title and Grace desperately trying to mediate between her husband's expectations and her daughter's dreams on that fateful morning. Palace staff reported, hearing raised voices coming from Grace's private study. Stephanie had presented her mother with an ultimatum. Either Grace would support her decision to leave Monaco and pursue her own path, or Stephanie would create such a scandal that the royal family would have no choice but to let her go. The threat was not empty. Stephanie had already been photographed at nightclubs in compromising situations, and paparazzi were paying enormous sums for any scandalous content involving the young princess. Grace, torn between her maternal love and her royal obligations, found herself in an impossible position. She had sacrificed her own dreams for duty, but could she ask the same of her daughter? The emotional toll of this internal conflict was visible to anyone who looked closely. Grace's hands shook as she held her morning coffee, and her usual composed demeanor cracked under the weight of indecision. What palace insiders finally revealed, years later, was that Grace had made a decision that morning she would support Stephanie's dreams, even if it meant defying Rainier and potentially damaging the monarchy. The drive to ROC Angel was meant to be more than just a return to the palace. It was going to be a journey during which mother and daughter would plan Stephanie's escape from royal life. Little did they know that their conversation would be cut short by tragedy, leaving their conflict forever unresolved. At approximately 9:30 a.m. on September 13, 1982, Grace Kelly emerged from the family's country home in ROC Angel, looking tired but determined. She had spent the night in restless contemplation, and those who saw her that morning noted the unusual pallor of her complexion and the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped her car keys. The original plan had been for the family's chauffeur to make the drive down the winding mountain road to Monaco, but Grace had insisted on driving herself. This decision would later be scrutinized endlessly, but those closest to her understood the reasoning. Grace needed privacy for what she anticipated would be a difficult but necessary conversation with Stephanie about their future. The car was a 1971 Rover P63500, not the newest vehicle in the royal garage, but one that Grace felt comfortable driving. What would emerge years later was that the car had been experiencing intermittent brake problems for several weeks. The royal garage had performed routine maintenance, but had not fully addressed the braking system issues that palace mechanics had noted in their reports. As Grace and Stephanie settled into the car, witnesses reported seeing an intense conversation begin almost immediately. Stephanie appeared animated, gesticulating with her hands, while Grace listened with the focused attention of a mother trying to understand her child's deepest desires. The emotional weight of their discussion was evident even to casual observers. The route they chose was the D37, a serpentine mountain road that offered spectacular views of the Mediterranean but demanded complete attention from drivers. Grace had driven this route hundreds of times over the years, but never before while managing such an emotionally charged conversation with her daughter and under the influence of the medication cocktail that was clouding her judgment. As their car disappeared around the first bend, heading toward a destiny that would shock the world. Little did anyone know that they were witnessing the final moments of one of Hollywood's greatest legends. At 10:15 a.m., Grace Kelly's Rover was navigating one of the most dangerous sections of the D37, a series of hairpin turns that required precise steering and complete attention. Eyewitness accounts from other drivers on the road that morning would later provide crucial details about the final moments before the crash, painting a picture that investigators initially refused to make public. Truck driver Eve Rami, who was traveling in the opposite direction, reported seeing the princess's car weaving slightly as it approached the sharp right-hand curve near the La Turbie intersection. What struck him as odd was that the car appeared to be slowing down and speeding up erratically, as if the driver was having difficulty maintaining consistent control. Another witness, local resident Marie Cordier, was tending her garden when she heard what she described as a terrible grinding sound, like metal scraping against metal. Looking up, she saw the Rover approaching the curve at what seemed to be an inappropriate speed, with what appeared to be smoke or steam coming from the rear of the vehicle. Inside the car, Stephanie would later recall fragments of those final moments through her trauma-induced haze. She remembered her mother suddenly gripping the steering wheel with both hands and saying something that sounded like "I can't," before the car began its unstoppable trajectory toward disaster. The truth that investigators discovered but initially withheld was that brake fluid was found along the road leading up to the crash site, indicating that the Rover's braking system had failed completely during those crucial seconds. Combined with Grace's medication-impaired reflexes and the emotional distraction of their intense conversation, the mechanical failure created a perfect storm of tragedy. But there was another detail that would haunt investigators for decades. Tire marks on the road suggested that in those final moments, Grace had attempted to steer away from the cliff. Her last act was trying to save her daughter's life, even as her own was slipping away. At precisely 10:18 a.m., Grace Kelly's fairy tale life came to a devastating end. The Rover P6 crashed through the retaining wall and plummeted down a 40-foot embankment, rolling multiple times before coming to rest against a cluster of trees. The impact was so severe that the car was nearly unrecognizable. Twisted metal and shattered glass marking the spot where Hollywood royalty met European royalty in tragedy. The first responder on the scene was local farmer Sesto Laquio, been working in his garden when he heard the terrible sound of metal crushing and glass shattering. Racing toward the noise, he found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The car lay on its roof, steam rising from the engine, and an eerie silence hung over the mountainside. Stephanie, though severely injured, was conscious and crying for her mother. Laquio later described the princess as a broken angel, her face covered in blood but her eyes wide with terror as she realized the extent of Grace's injuries. Grace herself was unconscious, trapped in the driver's seat, her breathing shallow and irregular. Monaco's emergency services arrived within minutes, but the remote location and difficult terrain made rescue operations challenging. As paramedics worked frantically to extract both women from the wreckage, it became clear that Grace's injuries were catastrophic. She had suffered severe head trauma, multiple fractures, and internal injuries that were beyond the scope of field treatment. The image that would remain burned into the minds of rescuers was Grace's right hand, still reaching toward her daughter, as if her final conscious act had been trying to protect Stephanie. Even in her unconscious state, her maternal instincts had remained intact. Little did the gathering crowd of onlookers know that they were witnessing the final chapter of one of the 20th century's most captivating love stories. Not the love between Grace and Rainier, but the complicated, all-consuming love between a mother and her children. Princess Grace Hospital in Monaco, ironically named after the woman now fighting for her life within its walls, became the center of global attention. As news of the accident spread like wildfire, Prince Rainier arrived within minutes of being notified. His usual composed demeanor shattered as he was confronted with the reality that his fairy tale was ending in the most brutal way possible. Dr. Charles Chatlin, the hospital's chief of neurosurgery, took charge of Grace's care. What he found during his initial examination was devastating: massive brain trauma, multiple skull fractures, and bleeding that could not be controlled through conventional surgical means. But the full extent of Grace's condition was kept from the public and even from some family members during those critical first hours. Stephanie, despite her own serious injuries, broken ribs, a hairline skull fracture, and severe sedation, insisting on remaining conscious so she could be near her mother. Palace staff later described the heartbreaking scene of the teenager, her face bandaged and her arm in a sling, holding vigil beside Grace's hospital bed. As word spread internationally, Monaco's tiny hospital was besieged by media from around the world. Hollywood legends who had worked with Grace began arriving. Cary Grant chartered a private jet from Los Angeles, while Jimmy Stewart canceled all commitments to be at his old friend's side. But the truth that none of them wanted to face was becoming increasingly apparent. Grace was not going to recover. The decision to remove life support came after 24 agonizing hours of false hope and desperate prayers. Brain scans revealed massive, irreversible damage, and Grace's vital signs were failing despite maximum medical intervention. At 10:35 p.m. on September 14, 1982, surrounded by her family and closest friends, Grace Kelly drew her last breath. The world had lost not just a movie star or a princess, but a woman whose grace and dignity had inspired millions. The fairy tale was over, but the questions about what really happened on that mountain road were just beginning. In the immediate aftermath of Grace Kelly's death, a carefully orchestrated campaign began to shape public understanding of the tragedy. The Monaco royal family, already reeling from the loss of their most valuable member, was determined to preserve both Grace's legacy and the principality's reputation. What followed was a systematic suppression of information that would keep the full truth hidden for decades. The official accident report, released just 3 days after the crash, was suspiciously brief and lacking in crucial technical details. The brake failure that multiple witnesses had observed was downplayed, described only as possible mechanical difficulties. The role of Grace's medications was not mentioned at all, despite clear evidence that her prescription drug use had reached dangerous levels. Most disturbing was the suppression of Stephanie's own account of the accident's final moments. The 17-year-old princess had attempted to tell investigators that her mother had complained of feeling dizzy and had said, "I can't see the road clearly," just before the crash. This testimony was deemed unreliable due to trauma and was not included in the official report. Dr. Jean Duplay, Grace's personal physician, was quietly transferred out of Monaco within weeks of the accident. His medical records regarding Grace's prescriptions mysteriously disappeared from palace files, and he refused all interview requests for the remainder of his career. When approached by investigative journalists years later, he would only say, "Some truths are too painful to serve any purpose." Perhaps most telling was the speed with which Grace's personal effects were removed from the crash site and the family's country home. Items that might have provided insight into her state of mind, diary entries, letters, medication, bottles, were gathered up by palace staff and never seen again. The truth, no one dared to speak, was that protecting Grace's image had become more important than understanding why she had died, leaving crucial questions unanswered and a family's grief compounded by guilt and secrecy. French authorities, responsible for investigating accidents on the D-37, found themselves caught between their duty to uncover the truth and enormous pressure for Monaco's royal family to avoid embarrassing revelations. What emerged from this conflict was an investigation that raised more questions than it answered, leaving crucial aspects of Grace Kelly's death forever shrouded in mystery. The mechanical inspection of the rover revealed brake fluid throughout the car's undercarriage and brake pads worn down to dangerous levels. Yet this evidence was dismissed in the official report as typical, where patterns that did not contribute to the accident. Former Monaco police inspector Claude Olivero, who participated in the investigation, later admitted in retirement that they were instructed to focus on driver error as the primary cause. Despite overwhelming evidence of mechanical failure, even more troubling was the handling of Grace's medical examination. The autopsy revealed high levels of multiple medications in her system, including concentrations that would have significantly impaired her reflexes and judgment. However, toxicology results were sealed by court order and have never been made public. Dr. Francois Levy, who performed the autopsy, was bound by confidentiality agreements that prevented him from discussing his findings until his death in 2019. Witness testimonies were similarly suppressed or discredited. The truck driver who had seen Grace's car weaving was told his statement was inconsistent with physical evidence, despite having no reason to fabricate his account. The farmer who reported seeing steam or smoke from the car was informed that his observation was irrelevant to the investigation's findings. Most damaging to the investigation's credibility was the treatment of photographic evidence from the scene. Multiple photographers had documented the crash site, but their images were confiscated by Monaco authorities and have never been released. When pressed about this, decades later, palace officials claimed the photographs were too disturbing to make public, an explanation that satisfied no one seeking the truth. Finally revealed documents from the French National Archives show that investigators were specifically instructed to conclude their inquiry within 2 weeks and to avoid any findings that might damage Monaco's international reputation or cause additional suffering to the grieving royal family. 42 years after Grace Kelly's death, the full truth about what happened on September 13, 1982, remains elusive, buried beneath layers of royal protocol, family grief, and institutional protection. But piecing together the suppressed evidence, witness testimonies, and revelations that have emerged over the decades, a clearer picture finally emerges of the tragic convergence of factors that led to the loss of Hollywood's most beloved princess. The evidence strongly suggests that Grace Kelly died as a result of a perfect storm of circumstances that individually might have been manageable, but together proved fatal. The mechanical failure of her car's braking system, documented but downplayed, created a dangerous situation that required split-second reflexes and perfect judgment. Her heavy medication use, hidden from public view but clearly evident in sealed medical records, impaired her ability to respond effectively to the emergency. Most heartbreaking of all, the emotional turmoil of her conversation with Stephanie about their shared future had created the kind of distraction that could prove deadly on Monaco's treacherous mountain roads. Grace Kelly, the woman who had seemed to have everything, was actually fighting battles on multiple fronts against her own body's failing systems, against medications that were poisoning rather than healing her, and against the impossible choice between royal duty and maternal love. The cover-up that followed, while perhaps intended to protect both Grace's memory and her family's privacy, instead created decades of speculation and conspiracy theories that have overshadowed the simple truth. Grace Kelly was a remarkable woman who found herself trapped in circumstances beyond her control, ultimately paying the highest price for the fairy tale life that millions had envied. Her death marked the end of an era, not just for Monaco or for Hollywood, but for a world that believed in the possibility of perfect love stories and happily ever after endings. The truth about Grace Kelly's final accident reveals something both more tragic and more human than any fairy tale. A woman who gave everything to others and left nothing for herself, whose greatest strength or devotion to those she loved ultimately became the source of her downfall. Grace Kelly's story doesn't end with her death on that Monaco mountainside. It lives on in the questions we continue to ask about the price of perfection, the weight of expectations, and the cost of living someone else's dream. Her legacy reminds us that behind every fairy tale lies a human being struggling with the same fears, doubts, and impossible choices that face us all. The truth about her final accident may never be fully known, but perhaps what matters more is what her life and death teach us about the dangers of pedestaling our heroes and the importance of seeing the humanity in those we admire. Grace Kelly was not just a princess or a movie star, she was a woman who loved deeply, sacrificed enormously, and died too young while trying to navigate an impossible world. What do you think really happened on that mountain road? Do the suppressed evidence and covered-up testimonies change how you remember Grace Kelly's legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age. The truth may be painful, but it's always worth pursuing.